We are so lucky tonight that we're going to get to talk about play in math classes and with a purpose. And we are here with David Coffey from Grand Valley. And if you want to go ahead and take it away, David, I think your mic needs to be turned on. All right, everyone, sorry about that. Give us a second when we get the sound going.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Global Math Department. We're having a few technical difficulties with the microphone for our speaker, but we're working on getting them resolved. Please be patient. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Sorry,
Oh,
I realized you couldn't hear me. I had muted myself. All right, so
yeah.
we will go ahead and try again. All right, if you want to introduce yourself, and we can get started.
Yeah, sorry about that, everybody. I had to change to a different browser. It didn't seem to like Safari. So my name's Dave Coffey. I'm a professor of mathematics and director of the Design Thinking Academy at Grand Valley State University. And I'm going to be giving a webinar here that I usually do with my wife, Kathy. She's a first grade teacher, and I'll do my best to channel her. She's got some of the best bits here. She typically makes the point, as a first grade teacher, she typically makes the point that games are sort of to math what read alouds are to English language arts. In other words, they provide a shared experience for all the students who are participating in this activity. And so I've used games with first graders and freshmen, undergraduates and graduate students, pre-service and in-service teachers. And while the focus today is going to be on upper elementary and middle school students, the ideas can be applied to any level. So Dave Kelly is an influential member of the design thinking community, and he describes design thinkers as intentional problem solvers. And I see the fundamental role of teachers. This is a fundamental role of teachers as well, being intentional problem solvers. And so my work with teachers typically entails helping teachers to move from intuition, doing things in the classroom that they would normally do naturally, and doing it intentionally. And so these are the three things that we're going to be working on tonight. So couldn't start without including this quote from one of my heroes, and I'll just let you read that. And then one of the tools that I use comes from Ella Ben-Ur. She's a designer who worked with David Kelly's firm IDEO, and she now teaches design thinking around the world. But it's based mostly in Boston at Olin College. And her Innovators Compass is a simple tool that provides people who want to explore the unknown with a concrete set of questions and a compact framework. And in my opinion, each time we enter a classroom, we are encountering uncharted territory. And I think that Innovators Compass can help us to make the work that we do with playing games intentional. So do me a favor and take a moment to look at this version of the compass and share in our chat what you notice and what you wonder about the chart. Yes, learner is at the center. That's a good point. People are, um, design thinking is often also called human-centered design. Oh yeah, man, that's a good point to think about who sort of owns each spot. Is it owned by the teacher or owned by the students? Yeah, design certainly is an iterative process, and so is the teaching learning cycle. Oh, Brock, that's a great observation. Hard to see on this slide, but yes, it goes from past and present to future. So we're building on what's worked in the past and what hasn't worked in the past. Yeah, it's great to think about it in terms of our lessons as experiments. So many times, especially as I'm working with pre-service teachers, they're concerned about getting it perfect, doing it right. And so it helps for them to think about teaching as an experiment. Yeah, Tyson, I'm just letting people look at and notice and wonder and type in the any ideas in the chat. Yeah, Jennifer, that's a good point. It could be, I mean, we might think a bit about it as objectives or learning goals. Ella chose to use principles. So you've noticed lots of things. Ella makes these resources available. They're free on her website, innovatorscompass.org. All she asks is that you give her credit and share how you use the compass on social media using the hashtag Innovators Compass. Well, there's part of the compasses that are numbered, and ideally, we might move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 around the compass. As we notice, it is an iterative process, and then after experiments, we might go back to observations. You can actually start anywhere on the compass, especially as our work as teachers. And so we're actually going to start at principles. That's up in that upper left-hand corner. Ella calls this the North Star, and that leads our exploration. This is the place where we want to be very focused. We don't want to be pulled in multiple directions. For our purposes tonight, the principles we are going to focus in on are doing mathematics. These are related to the mathematical practices found in the Common Core state standards. William McCollum, one of the authors of the math standards, combined these practices in ways that make them easier to remember. My wife Kathy and I used to try to remember all eight. We'd go on walks and see if we could remember all eight. And it was difficult for us sometimes. So we were so grateful when Bill came up with this particular framework and thought about this idea of 2 and 3, reasoning and explaining going together, modeling and using tools, 4 and 5 going together, and seeing structure and generalizing, 7 and 8 going together, and then persevering at problem solving and attending to precision going across all the other 6 practices. So this is the time where we would usually have you break into pairs or teams and actually play a game. But because this format sort of makes that difficult, we're going to play a game together. We're going to play a game called Breaking Bingo. You can read the instructions that are there. And as we're playing, what I'd like us to think about is, again, in the lower left-hand corner, that idea of what's happening. trying to make intentional observations. If you think about the 5 practices, if you're familiar with Peg Smith's work, this is this idea of monitoring. And so while we want to allow opportunities for students to play, to engage in authentic games, we also want to make sure that uh, the learning's meaningful, that we're not leaving to chance a roll of a dice or a draw of a card. So we can intentionally leverage against the objectives, in this case, the mathematical practices that we're looking for. So I use a random number generator for this game when I play it with upper elementary and middle school students. I do that because a number like, let's say 67 comes up. There's a couple of different ways to do 67. So you might type 67 as 60 plus 7, or you might do 67 as 59 plus 8. And so what I'd like you to do is we play this game. You type the pair that you want to break the number down to. Okay? So let's give it a go. And again, as we're playing, you want to keep in mind what you notice other people typing out, and how the mathematical practices might come into play. Okay? So the first number is 28. What are the ways that you can find to make 28 on the bingo card? Go ahead, type those in the chat, please. Ah, Nanette, very nicely done. So at this point, we start seeing some other possibilities. People try to break it up into uh, um, 3 add-ins instead of 2. We could also use products. That's a great point that we do it. And we can do some subtraction. So this is great. So what we notice is that we often get players breaking the game once we give permission, breaking the game. So let's do 96 now. Let's try to keep it with just addition, just for the sake of playing the game. So addition of pairs, pair of add-ins. What are the ways to do 96? Yeah, students will often ask at this point if they can do more than 2 numbers. And I tell them maybe later. It's interesting, again, how breaking the game encouraged them to think creatively and ask what if. What are the ways that we would make 96? Oh, nice. So here's again where we get a chance to see some different ones: 26 and 70, 41 and 55, 70 and 26. Again, this is the nice using the random generator from 1 to 100 makes for a nice way to especially get those larger numbers. I tried this out a couple times and just used the regular ones, and students were dissatisfied, obviously, when we got to 75. Right? What about 43? What happens when we add 43 to the mix? 13 and 30, a lot of those. 34 and 9, nice. 20 and 23. So this one too, students often ask, could they do just 43 since that's there? And I say, but there's no zero. They say, how about using the free space? And since I want to encourage creativity, I usually cave and say, sure, you can do 43 in the free space. So if you want to, feel free to use 43 equals 43 plus zero. And I'm also encouraging them, it's okay for us here that we're not using, but I'm actually encouraging them to write a number sentence, and I encourage them to write it as 43 equals, so that they see the equal sign as a relationship and not as a result. So it's not 34 plus 9 gives me 43. It's 43 is equivalent to 39 and 9. What about 75? What happens when we get 75? Again, yes, 75 could just be covered. Going along that same idea, we could use 75 in the free space, thinking about that as being 0. And that's the other thing, is if you find a better pair, you can always do that and then also rewrite the original. So if you'd had 43 equals 43 and 0 before, but would rather now use 75 and 0, then you just need to, if you want to, come up with a different one for 43. We try to encourage them not to use the same number in multiple sentences. Although, again, we're breaking bingo. If that's what you want to do, feel free to do it. Yes, and it's nice. You can, as Sheila has it written, 75 equals 55 plus 22, and then Melissa has it 68 plus 7 equals 75. Really structuring this idea or reinforcing the structure of the equal sign as a relationship. And then the last one, 83. What two numbers would you sum up to get 83? Yeah, Lori, that's a good question. So when I first started doing this, I only used one to try to make so the question is, do you use a variety of bingo cards? In the past, so when I started, I just used one because they could make some different choices. A group of fifth graders were very unhappy with me when I did that. And so I started afterwards giving a different set of bingo cards, but still not feeling necessarily like I had to make sure everybody had a different one. And there's a set. So at the end of this webinar, I'll give you a link to a folder that has a bunch of games, the games that we usually play, but it also has Breaking Bingo in it, and you can. It has multiple cards in it. So it's interesting, even we, as I'm looking at it, tend to look for first something that we could notice, look for a lot of the decade numbers, like looking at 70 and 13, 63 and 20. Oh, I love, yeah, Brock, that's a great idea to think about. You could do this also with some negative integers. It'd be interesting, Brock, are you thinking about using it with negative integers as the the sum, or putting some of the numbers on the bingo cards as negative integers, negative numbers. So by this time, usually we have somebody who's gotten bingo, and then I'll ask the students to share their number sentences. I'll write them up on the board as they say them, and then as a class, we check those off. Um, it's really important to recognize up to this point, seriously, um, the numbers have been random. It's been nice that 43 and 75 came up so that we could talk about that relationship with zero, but they have been random. I mean, that's the point of a random number generator. This is also the reason why some teachers that I work with aren't real comfortable with games, or less comfortable, because um, there's no certainty that any sort of learning is going to happen. And so it's important. This is a place where Kathy would remind us that this is simply a shared experience. And so now we want to make it an intentional experience. And in order to do that, we're going to return to our compass, and use that to help us think about our um, where we go next. So let's focus on observations. So if you need to, go ahead and scroll back through the chat. And what are some things that you notice about the number sentences people came up with? Go ahead and add that to our chat, please. So Jennifer's noticing some structure. What are some other things that we notice, or potentially we could do if we're no longer using random numbers, but we're selecting the numbers, we're creating the scenarios? Yeah, starting with the sum and then the add-ends on the right really hopefully helps them to notice again that this idea that the equal sign is a relation and not a result. Um, Even at the university level, I see a lot of students who feel like the equal sign the answer has to be on the right side of the equal sign. Yeah, Lori, the commutative property is something that we could be uh, intentional about. Yes, Viviana, exactly. If we create the scenarios, we can anticipate the solutions and then talk about the different ways to get to the same number. And think about, so how did we look for those ways? The commutative property. Yeah, Sheila, picking the number. So this is really depending on how long you want to give students. If you're going to do it quickly, finding so that the units digit is what you're looking for sometimes helps us to start. But then going back to Viviana's point, it might be then if I know 13 plus 70 is 83, I can also do 84 and 69. And so we can talk about some things like compensation. Yeah, so giving an opportunity, Sheila, that's a good point. So this was a place where you might include another task like a number talk to ask students to share their strategies about what's going on. That would be a way to gather even more information about what's happening and why. It would also fit with, as we're remembering our principles, upper left-hand corner, what matters most. It's this idea of doing math, and one of those principles in doing math from the math practices is this idea of reasoning and communicating. Yeah, Lori, it's interesting to think about from an ad end. Do you start with a smaller ad end or the larger ad end as you're thinking about this? Yeah, so that's great, Vivian. I mean, we've got to be comfortable with the idea that students might bring in some new ideas. And in fact, when I work with teachers, I talk to them about I'd much rather they had a stance of as an educational researcher than as a teller, someone telling somebody else what to do. I want you to be curious about students' ways of thinking. And again, the nice thing about the compass is it provides that sort of curiosity. It's got those questions. Embedded into the structure of the tool. So as you're thinking about again the entire compass now we've talked a little bit about principles, we've thought a little bit about observations. We then next might want to start thinking about who's involved, who are the students that we are working with, and how might they respond to something like this, and that might again be give us some ideas about what numbers we want to attend to. We also might start thinking about what ways are there. So we played the game, now what? This is a really important point about the entirety of a lesson is that there needs to be opportunity for students to reflect, to consolidate their reasoning, to consolidate their thinking, to consolidate what they've learned. When students go home and tell their parents or guardians, when the question comes up, "What did you learn today?" and they say nothing, that might likely be true if they haven't had a chance to reflect and connect. And so we need to think about what ways are there to go. To make sure that there's opportunities for reflection, and then we've got to decide what we want to try. And again, the keeping the structure of the compass in mind allows us to do that work, to do the work of teaching. So here are some ideas of ways that are out there. Many of you are probably familiar, again, we brought up a little bit earlier, the 5 practices. So that might be one idea. Mathematicians chair is akin to readers or writers chair. So that's where you might have one individual, maybe it's the person who quote unquote won, come up and talk about their strategy, how they did it. Viviana has already brought up this idea of creating game scenarios, being very intentional about about the numbers that we choose. There's also the expert commentator, where we step outside the game and look back at it as an expert commentator, or there may be some other favorite reflection activity of your own. Um, so as you're thinking about reflection, what are some ways you might reflect or give our students opportunities to reflect on their work from Breaking Bingo? Go ahead and add your ideas into the chat. Here again is where our um, our English language arts strategies can come in really handy. Letter to a sick friend at the very end, asking someone to write a letter to somebody who wasn't there is a way to help them to consolidate, to explain their thinking and communicate. Again, keeping the principles in mind. What, so what, now what is another nice reflection activity that helps them maybe look for some structure. What did they notice? What was important about what they noticed? How might they apply what they noticed? Are there other reflection activities that you've used? Yeah, Stephanie, you're raising your hand. The beauty of this part of the compass where we're getting these ideas out is we can combine these ideas. We have these ideas for some other time. If we wish, we can come back to these ideas. But getting a bunch of different possibilities allows us to be flexible as we go to the next step where we decide what's the experiment to try. Yeah, Sheila, that's a great one. Think, pair, share is a great way to give them the opportunity to discuss. So once you do decide on a way, now we get to the experiment. And once we get to the experiment, then we need to add some extra details. I want to share with you a little bit about the expert commentator. This was a method that was introduced to me by Doug Fisher. He's a professor, a literacy professor at San Diego. Um, and what he talked about was this idea of thinking of our role as educator as an expert commentator. So when something happens, when we have this activity in class, when we have this game in class, we then take time to point out and notice, just like an expert color commentator um, might do. Um, the expert commentator can anticipate what's going to happen because they've seen the routine beforehand. They've thought about. We talked about this before. They think about ways that students might solve it. They have experiences that we don't, that put certain moves in context. They slow the routine down and highlight what we missed using a telestrator, as we can see in the picture here. They might explain things. They explain scoring if we were talking about like a gymnast routine. So they might explain things that a novice might know, conventions that someone who's new to the sport or new to the mathematical activity. Um, and our attention, if we go think again about the compass, our attention into our observations, as we get better at doing that, the details become clearer as we go forward. Yeah, so Stephanie talks about I can see my students breaking down the numbers as friendly tens and then building from there. So that would be an observation. Now the fact is, how do we highlight that observation? That's what the expert commentator would do, would be finding a way to highlight that, choosing maybe, so this might be a combination with a scenario, a game scenario where a particular number comes up and we have that opportunity, or a particular board is available that allows them to break it into tens. That's a nice example. So we talked about that people are at the center, and so for me, one of the people that's at the center now is my grandson Vance. Vance is 2 in this picture. And if I were thinking about playing this game with Vance, keeping our students in mind, that might help as I'm thinking about the specifics, about the scenario that I want to address as an expert commentator. We have to remember that the curricula that we use were not written with our students in mind. And so we are going to need to make adjustments for students. And it's okay if you start by just thinking about one student. How is that one student going to be impacted by this? And then because we're going to have these opportunities where we're sharing and we're talking about different ways of thinking, it'll expand to other students, but keep one student in mind. So like I said, Vance is 2 at this point in this picture. But what about when he's in kindergarten? Okay, so in kindergarten, the intention I might be is that we play the regular game, right? And focus on number recognition and attending to precision. I don't just hope 13 or 31 comes up. I provide the scenario where 13 is drawn and then ask the students which one to cover and why. This essentially then becomes a number talk after this. And so we're being intentional about the numbers we choose and what we're trying to get at, what we're looking for during this time. It's okay. There was time before during the play that it was very low floor, what Joe Bowler talks about as low floor, high ceiling tasks. But now when we're in the reflection piece, we again want to be focused. Earlier, we talked about whose role is it, the teachers or the students. This is a place where the teacher needs to take a little more guidance in terms of the attention that we're paying. Now imagine Vance is maybe in 2nd grade and he plays the game like we played it and to decompose 2 numbers. And I want to focus on compensation and looking for and making use of structure. So again, I don't want to wait until a particular number comes up where we can do that. I'm going to pick 38 so that we can look at this structure, this idea of what happens when I take from one and give to the other. Does that maintain equivalence? Does that maintain that amount? But it's intentional, and I'm asking them to look for that structure so that they can apply it later. So again, they can start by maybe looking for those decades numbers, but then making adjustments when they're looking for a particular number. Maybe in 5th grade, we start breaking bingo even more, the way that some of you were doing it. And we play where they can use all 4 operations, the parentheses and brackets, and they can use as many numbers as they can and want in order to focus on order of operations and persevering at problem solving. Can they get a bingo with just one number doing that? And there are the highlights that I might stress, but I also want to remember the principles that I decided to focus on. So I could focus on order of operation, but I also want to focus maybe on structures of 0 and other things that they notice as they're trying to do it that they could apply to other games. So then what's next? So after you've played, you've got that, what's next? The game is available. You can have them play it. They can break it more. But what if you don't have the opportunity? I know that a lot of teachers that I work with have a curriculum that they need to follow pretty closely. And so you might not have games, or you might not be able to spend time playing breaking bingo. So what then? And I want to encourage, again, this is uncharted territory, an opportunity to be creative. And so we want to get in the mindset of creativity. And so we're going to play a game called This Is Not a Fork. And so in the chat, I want you to tell me what that is. If it's not a fork, what is it? Maybe it's a trident for a fish. Maybe it's a comb, a mustache comb. What do you think that is if it's not a fork? Please add your thoughts into the chat. This is an opportunity for us to practice being creative. Excellent. Oh, I love a rake. Yeah, that's nice. Musical instrument, good. Try to come up with a couple. Don't be satisfied with one. Build on somebody else's idea. A really poor tool for eating soup. I love it. Oh, I like thinking about changing the dimensions. Nobody said it's that size. So what if it was larger? Or what if it was smaller? Does what it's made out of make a difference? Yeah, yep. Forky toy. I saw there was something on social media. Somebody was using it to help hang hang a picture. You put it on the nail, and then you put the picture over the fork, and it slides down right onto the nail. So there's no more looking behind it. So you can find really practical uses for these things. It's like sticky notes. Sticky notes weren't intended to be sticky notes at first. So if we can think about things, see things from a different perspective, it can help. So what is this? How does this relate to our work in teaching, particularly if I'm having to use a curriculum that's not very creative? Well, we play this same game. So I do this a lot with the pre-service and in-service teachers I work with things like a worksheet or a page in a textbook or a test, maybe a review test. And so we play this game called This Is Not a Test. And we try to think about all the different ways that it could be, other things that it could be, and we've come up with things like self-assessment, a sorting activity, a torture device, a scavenger hunt. And so the self-assessment, we then start getting into details. The self-assessment was asking students to pick the ones that they could do by themselves, the ones they could do with a friend, the ones that they would need the help of a teacher to do. The sorting activity, you could sort that way, but you could also sort it from a standpoint of from least to greatest. What answer was the smallest? What was the greatest? Which ones were greater than one? Which ones were less than one? And so that sorting, you could make them into cards, and you could have a sorting activity. You could play war with them, right? Keeping that same idea where you cut them up into cards and you had them play war with them. Torture device, that's what a lot of students, even my students, felt like a test was. But it was really interesting. So they took it and they changed it to the idea of, so which 5 questions would you give to your worst enemy as a torture? And so that gave us some insight into the problems that they felt like were really hard. And one of our favorites is a scavenger hunt. So, from a standpoint of a game, if you have to give a worksheet, or if you have to do a particular page, instead of asking them to do all the problems, ask them to find one answer. So, for instance, if this is not a test, it's a scavenger hunt. The answer one of these items is 19/24. Which item is it? How would you go about finding which item it is? Again, if that's hard to see, there is another example in the handouts of that page, and you can look at and see how would you figure out which one's 1924s. Would you do them all? Go ahead and type your ideas into the chat. Yeah, Matt, estimation's a good example. Yeah, you could, Melissa, that's a good point. You could step out and do a bunch of different task cards, not just one. Yep, the numerator is a good way to help thinking about it. And again, that's not something that our students necessarily know, so it might be something we need to highlight. Yes, Sheila, thinking about so going back to sorting, which ones are greater or less. So if you'd like to see some more on Twitter, we've been using Worksheet Wizardry as another place, another repository of places to put ideas. If you're I don't want to say stuck, but I'm going to say stuck with a curriculum. It's a way to take and look at the page or the worksheet or the test and to think about doing those things differently. So I put this one in. My wife and I want to always put this in because it's also a reminder if you are working with an administrator who thinks you're just doing games and playing games all the time, and that's not teaching. That's not true. That there's lots and lots and lots of effort that goes into trying to make sense of organizing and ensuring that learning's happening. One of the last things I want to let you think about and maybe apply it here is that Innovators Compass is also a very nice reflection activity in and of itself. And so, if at the end of playing a game, we were to give the Innovators Compass to students, they could fill in their observations themselves about what happened, what was important, what matters, and then maybe some things that they might try. And so we talked earlier about that some of this work might be the work of students and some of the work might be the work of teachers, but this is an opportunity for us to turn even more and more of this work over to students because we know the more that they're involved, the more that they do, the more likely that the learning is going to last. And so take a moment and think for yourself. So what happened this last, besides it taking a while for me to get the mic to work. What happened for this last 55 minutes? What matters for what we did, and what might be something that you might try? And we'd appreciate it if you'd share that in the chat. So what did you notice? I expect almost a notice, uh, but what happened, what matters, and what might you try? Yeah, the bingo game is such a nice example of something that is familiar but starts getting to think about things differently. Yeah, Matt, that's a good point. I think games really fit along the lines of what Joe Bowler has said before about this idea of low floor, high ceiling tasks. Yeah, Melissa, the bingo game is so great because you can pull it out anytime, and then it can actually be, if you do centers, a center by itself, where students are, you give them a set of numbers and they try to find a bingo. Yeah, that's a great point, Elizabeth. I mean, it can be, you can do the worksheet wizardry with just about any content. Again, you can do it even at the collegiate level, right, in a calculus course. Yeah, my pre-service teachers also like this idea of it's not a test, and in particular, they found it as they're working with students useful, and just giving students choice, asking students how the torture device came up was, it was this idea of giving some students some choice, because especially adolescents, if we don't give them choice, which problems do you want to do? Their only choice is to do them or not. So thank you so very much for your participation and again your patience at the beginning as we got this started. Sorry we had to push through some things a little bit quicker than I wanted to as a result. There is a Google folder using this tiny URL, Math Play Purpose. You need to be careful with the capitalization, but that has all of the activities that we usually use, and it's broken up by grade level. So hopefully that's useful. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me on Twitter. I'm Delta_DC, or shoot me an email, Coffey, COFFEYD at gbsu.edu. So thanks for taking an hour to do and play some math.
Um, and so a little housekeeping. I'm gonna stop the recording.